the mind is your life force. It's driving your lungs, your heart, your brain function, everything. And so how we manage our mind has to be a priority.
I want to start off by asking you about this. You say that we are psychoneurobiological
I knew
creatures.
you'd grab that term. I knew it. I just know because you love the science. Yes.
What does that mean? Can you share that?
Psycho meaning mind, neuro meaning brain, biology meaning body. So I'm basically a psychoneurobiologist because I research the mind-brain-body connection. So it's helping people to understand that everything that we do is coming from our mind. Our mind is driving everything, as our aliveness. And what we do is our mind then uses the brain as a substrate and our body, and the combination together is how we then show up. So mind on its own can't really do much. Brain on its own does nothing, and body on its own does nothing. They'll just disintegrate. So mind is giving the brain and body life, and our unique way that we use our brain and our body with our mind then affects how we function and show up.
It's so crazy because the popular paradigm with science right now doesn't really take the mind into account. We've talked about this in the past, but there are entire fields of psychoneuroendocrinology, psychoneuroimmunology, and really looking at how our mind is deeply influencing. It's really as you shared, it's the root of our existence.
It is. I always use the example that if I had a dead brain in my hand, and I think I've used this with you before, but it's worth saying it again, that we could stare at this brain. If I took someone's brain out their head, we could stare at that brain all day and it wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't produce thought. It wouldn't produce a beautiful painting. It wouldn't produce the conversation we're having now. It can't make anything because it's just physical substance. Something needs to switch it on and make it work. And that's where the mind comes in. Because at the moment, you and I are alive, and our brain is our mind is using the brain to actually respond to us, and we are making 800,000 to 1 million cells every second, and those are distributed across our entire body, including the brain. But if you're dead, you're not doing that. And it's kind of almost hard to get your head around what I'm saying, but the mind is pretty much our life force. It's driving your lungs, your heart, your brain function, everything. And so how we manage our mind has to be a priority. And you talk about that. You talk about, your own physical injury that you just recently had and how your mind basically facilitated the healing process. And, you see that all the time.
Right. Or can hinder as well.
Or can hinder.
And this is where your new book and by the way, this book is one of my absolute favorites of the year. And I think this should be mandatory reading for every parent, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, because you also structured in a way that you can communicate with your younger children or even moving into our teens as well. But there's no better time to start than now. And How to Help Your Child Clean Up Their Mental Mess is the new book. And if you could, let's start off by talking a little bit about the landscape right now with mental health in our children.
Well, absolutely. Well, thank you, Shawn, for that. And this book's been years in the making, considering I have 4 adult children. So I've gone through the process of parenting and still am parenting. You never stop. But looking at bringing up a child from very young, and a lot of when I practiced, which I did for 25 years, a large portion of my patients were young children and helping in family therapy and that kind of thing. And then you look at the landscape, and we have a constant cry that, from the Surgeon General to just every media article daily coming out, literally, not every, but so many media articles coming out saying things like, we have a crisis of mental health. It's the cry on everyone's lips. Kids' suicide rates are up. It's in every age group, but it's really a concern when it's so young. But I look at that and I look at this, and I've watched this for 38 years of being in this field, and I watched with my patients and kind of observed and did the research parallel, and the concern that I have, and the way I think a good way to sort of explain this is, yes, we do have a mental health crisis. There's absolutely no doubt about that. We do have children battling more than they've ever battled in adolescence and so on. But we have to look at why and when. And it's from around about the mid-90s. So, going back sort of between 40 and 56 years, that we shifted how we look at mental health. And from the mid-90s, that shift was already being observed and big studies were being done. And people don't talk about these studies, but there's been a large amount of scientific research questioning the shift. So what was the shift? We shifted from being very focused on the mind. Back in the 80s, we still spoke about the mind and the brain. Interestingly, in the 80s, the brain was seen as something that couldn't change. And that was one of the challenges that I took up and did some of the first neuroplasticity research, because if your mind's changing, obviously your brain's changing.
Right.
So they got that right, that they got the part right of mind and brain working together, but they got that brain can't change wrong. Then we advance and we see with advanced technology, brain can change. So suddenly mind gets just dropped and everything becomes about the brain, because suddenly the advances from the mid-90s to the current day have been so incredibly overwhelming and exciting and dominated that we become a society of being a kind of like a neuroreductionistic society. So if you just look at the brain, as I already said, we can look at a dead brain, it'll do nothing. We have to just kind of see what's happened here. If we focus so much on the brain, so much on the physical, to the point where the only way that we can actually then deal with things is through looking at symptomology if something goes wrong. So someone's got diabetes, they're going to have certain symptoms, and if someone's got cardiovascular issues, there's certain symptoms. So the medical model is beautiful for that. Take a symptom, do the testing, do the diagnosis, which implies there's a biological cause, and hopefully have some sort of specific way of treating that. We keep advancing, works beautifully. But with our neuroreductionistic shift in the last 50, 60 years, we also started classifying a person's experience in the same bucket. And that's where the problem came in. So my personal belief and my research experience and clinical experience, and not just myself, but there's thousands of scientists that will corroborate what I'm about to say. We believe that the mental health crisis in children is not because there's some weird illness that's now increasing, because it's talked about as a mental illness, and that we have to be astounded and thrown by why is mental illness increasing, like it's this mystifying thing. That's not the question. We're asking the wrong questions. What we need to do is say, what have we been doing for the last 50, 60 years that has resulted in this problem? And what we've done is we shifted our philosophy to looking at the brain instead of the person and their life and context and story and narrative, and focus solely on the symptoms that the brain was supposedly producing, and shifted it to mental illness. Now, it's interesting that the two should parallel, that the increase in mental illness in children, and let's rephrase that, the increase in mental health challenges in children, which is more accurate scientifically, has increased over the last 40, 50 years as we shifted our philosophy. So therefore, the issue is that we have to look at how we've managed mental health. We've done a terrible job. And that's why I've spent the last 40 years observing this and trying to offer an alternative that is science-based, that is actually thousands of years old. What I'm teaching is not new. Yeah. I've just taken it into modern science and made it into an accessible format. So it's a long answer, but it's important to kind of lay that foundation.
Absolutely, yeah. And, here's the thing. We're both very big on results.
Yes.
Just look at the results of what we've been doing. Has it been working? And not only is it not working, things are getting significantly worse. But there's this groundswell, there's a shift that's happening thanks to work like yours and having access to platforms like this, and really helping to spread the message and get folks educated in an entirely new way. You just shared something that is so important, which is we've been really becoming more and more mechanistic in our view of things, right? Going from taking the mind out of the equation, which everything is springing from that, to like trying to isolate and drill down and find the parts. Like I found the little thing that's making us sick, right? And then we get into this with this mechanistic view, and there's still kind of mechanistic operation around, quote, chemical imbalances, right? We found these certain chemicals. You have a chemical imbalance. That's what the problem is. And you also shared last time we talked a little bit about this, that even the serotonin theory of serotonin deficiency of depression was disproved a long time ago.
Many years.
And yet we're still seeing the wake of that, and all of the commercials, all the billions upon billions of dollars made with SSRIs, and again trying to target a chemical imbalance largely based off of a conversation.
Exactly, and a hypothesis that's been disproved. and consistently disproved. But yet that's the conversation and what's being told to people because it's a nice story. Shawn, I just read a study this morning about how they're showing that children that have been put on Adderall and Ritalin from young and would pretty much any age, the symptoms, the side effects that produces in a child are basically fulfill the criteria that the DSM uses to diagnose pediatric bipolar. I mean, let's talk about tautologies. We're going in complete circles here of going back. And some of the top neuroscientists in the world have done meta-analyses and have gone back in depth and looked at the research over the years in the field, and have published papers very recently just showing that what we've done for 45, 50, 60 years is not working. The treatments are inefficient. They are making people worse. And this is the crisis we're seeing. We're not seeing a crisis of some weird new illness. We are seeing a crisis of management. So that's why I've decided this book has to come out now, because we've got to get our kids, our parents understanding themselves to be able to understand their children. And my youngest patient was 2 and 3 years of age. My children have grown up with this stuff from young. They've been immersed in this since they were babies. You can teach a child of 2 how to manage their mind, and that sounds very weird, but we'll dive into it. I'm sure in this interview. So
the initial part is just realizing that this exists, you know, and we somehow we're strangely separated from a thing we can't be separated from. We don't even know that this is, the tip of the spear really, and where everything is coming from. And actually, in your new book, you detail how we all wire our life experiences into the neural networks of our brain and throughout our entire body with our mind. And you talked a little bit about it. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Absolutely. So let's take, for the people listening now, the most obvious thing. We're having a conversation and they're either watching or listening. And that is an experience that they're having. How are you able to actually do this? Because you're alive. So you're listening, either sitting in your office or wherever, in the car, either listening, but as the listeners are experiencing this experience, which is this conversation about mental health. So because they're alive, they can hear the auditory sound waves. They can hear, they are receiving them. The mind is receiving the auditory sound waves, and the eyes are receiving the electromagnetic light waves. It's creating gravitational fields, and all that fancy physics stuff is being absorbed into our biofield, which is basically an energy that is the thing that you pick up on an EKG or an EEG or an ECG or any sonar, ultrasounds, Dopplers. What we are, when we read the body, they use that technology to read the body, what we are reading basically is the energy moving through different organs and the effectiveness of how it moves through organs. So essentially, when someone's listening, the experience is converted to energy. It's picked up by the biofield of our mind as energy. Our psychological part of our functioning as humans then is basically how we experience what we're hearing. So there's the physical level, physics level, and then there's the psychological level. And all that combines and gets put into the brain. The mind literally filters, takes it, puts it into the brain, and the brain responds. And the brain responds, and that's really important to get that, because the brain does what the mind tells it to do. The brain is reliant on the mind's guidance and direction, and it feeds the brain. That's the nutrition for the brain, or whatever you want to call it. So the brain then responds electromagnetically, electrochemically, and on an energetic level. So we call that quantum physics, and also genetically. It's like waves. If you think of the waves of the sea, they go from these big swells to the beach where they build up, have the white crest and crash on the beach, and little waves, and then suck it in, and the whole thing repeats itself constantly. That's what it kind of looks like in the brain. So our experiences, this conversation is going to create that kind of wave effect in the brain. And as the wave crashes on the beach, that then causes a electrochemical, neurochemical response and a genetic response. Now, when we talk about a genetic response, it means that our genes are being switched on, like you switch on a light. Genes can't switch themselves on. They also have to be switched on, and it's the mind energy that does that. They switch on, and when they switch on, they make stuff. They make amino acids, and amino acids make proteins, and proteins go into whatever's needed. In the case of an experience, those proteins basically grab the information as little pockets of the little energy vibrations are kind of collapse into these little amino acids that form proteins, strings of proteins, and you grow branches, you grow trees like we see over here. So what was an energy experience, what's a bunch of different energy, eventually becomes a little vibration inside a protein which grows into branches. So the more we say, the more we're growing. So if I grab this over here, the source, what we're saying, what I'm saying, what you're asking me, is going to be the roots of the thought that we're building. So the experience becomes a thought in your brain, and the source of the experience is the roots. And then how you interpret, how you uniquely interpret what you're hearing, becomes the branches. So the thought is a real physical thing, and that is what the experience becomes. So experience, our conversation, all this energy stuff, brain stuff, genetic stuff, protein stuff, boom, we have a thought physically wired into the brain, which is neuroplasticity happening in action. And the source is the roots, as I said, the root memories, and the branches are the interpretation memories. So an experience becomes a thought made of memories in your brain. As it's forming in the brain, it also creates gravitational fields inside the mind that are related so it's linked 3 places that we're building this thought made of memories. So it's a gravitational field in the mind. It is a psychological memory that we are aware of. It is a physical structural protein structure in the brain that looks like a tree. And then in the cell, it actually builds into what we call the microtubules, which form this like the skeleton of a cell, and they actually hold the vibrations, and so they're memories in the body as well. That's why we experience it in our body. So in very simple terms, we take what we experience, what we see, what we hear, what we watch, the discussion, the learning to play a sport, everything from the moment you open your eyes till the moment you go to sleep, all of that's becoming energy that goes through this process. So we are building our life into thoughts in our brain, gravitational fields in our mind, and changes in our cells all day long. And then at night time we sort out those thoughts, and the combination that we build is good and bad, hopefully more good than bad, but sometimes, and then the bad or the toxic obviously has degrees of badness, if that makes sense. So like 1, 2, 3 being just the day-to-day stuff, 8, 9, 10 being the bad stuff that really builds.
Holy moly. And this is happening all the time.
All day long.
Every microsecond, whether we realize it or not.
It's happening on a 95%, 95 to 99% that we on our non-conscious, N-O-N, not unconscious. Unconscious is when we're sleeping, or we've been put under anesthesia, anesthetic or something. But that's not mind. That's a brain state. Mind is the non-conscious, N-O-N, and that's where all this stuff is happening. And we are only aware really of about 1 to 5%, maybe 10%. We're only consciously aware of stuff. So we're only conscious when we're awake. And when we're consciously awake, we choose to focus, like now, we choose to focus on this conversation. This is only around about somewhere between 1 and 10% of what's really going on. 95% of we are absorbing on an unconscious level what's going on around us. And that's why we can not be directly concentrating on something, but all around us there's this conversations or zeitgeist or politics or things we're looking at or drive past. Your mind, brain, body, psychoneurobiology is absorbing that. And when we wire in things that you constantly hear a same message that is very disturbing, but you don't consciously focus on it, it's still being absorbed. This happens to all of us, children and adults. That wires in maybe as a toxic issue as opposed to something healthy. So it's not all bad, but there are bad things, and that can impact everything about how you function in different ways. So therefore, our non-conscious is our best friend, and it's on our side, and it looks for these things. So at night when we're sleeping, it evaluates what we've built during the day, and basically that's why we dream and have nightmares. Obviously dreams, nightmares, and it finds the most disruptive experiences that we've wired in, and then makes us aware of those. And it makes us aware of those when we're awake. Dreams and nightmares while we're sleeping, because it's kind of doing housework, and when we housekeeping, when we wake up, it comes through into our conscious mind via the subconscious, which is a bridge, as signals. And that's another sort of part of the conversation, but that's essentially the process that's happening. So those signals last thing in this, and then I know you've got a lot of questions around what I've said, and you're great at unpacking my long answers. The signals are attached to a thought.
Yeah.
So the experience into the brain through all that stuff lands up being these thoughts. Nighttime when you sleep, it finds those. When you wake up, it sends those through the subconscious as signals. And those, as it sends them through, those signals are coming from that. So the subconscious says, okay, that's a problem in your head. It's messing your life, your mind. It's messing with you. This is the most disruptive thing. There's probably 10 things or whatever. And so when it sends the signals, what's key here is they're coming from that thought. So here's the clue. If you pay attention to the signals, it'll pull up the associated thought. And that's what we need to do. We need to become conscious and work through, why am I thinking like this? You know, and you may think, oh, this discomfort I'm feeling. Oh, it's actually because, you know, maybe I've been focusing too much on politics or whatever without even realizing I'm getting sucked into this on social media or whatever the case may be. So that's the basic principle happening.
Here's the thing. Today, more than ever, we are so distracted and we don't do that internal investigation. And that's one of the big catches to this situation right now. And obviously, there's so many rich things to unpack there. And one of them, just mentioning even our dream state, like it has value. We don't place any value in that in our culture. It's just it's so weird, you know, like, why am I dreaming about being on a pirate ship with Shaquille O'Neal? And, you know, like there's like dolphins that are really, I don't know, Dr. Caroline Leaf. Like, what is this trying to tell me, you know? Yeah. And our ancestors had more of a kinship with these things. But today we know that there is the mechanistic view. We know that there's so much processing of metabolic waste. There's a lot of cleaning that takes place.
It's housekeeping.
Right? And so even your title of the book, Cleaning Up the Mental Mess, we see the physical aspect, but it's the psychoneurobiological whole thing is kind of cleaning house if we allow it. Now, we also have a very sleep deprived culture, ironically, as well. So, but one of the most important things that you shared that I want everybody to really understand is that your thoughts are physical. They're a real thing. And we just, again, we don't value our thoughts. We don't think about our thinking. And a lot of this stuff is just on automatic, kind of a regurgitation, you know, stuff just going on again and again. And these can be signals. And we can change our thoughts. But if we believe that our brain is what it is, it's just going to keep doing this thing, and we don't realize that we have agency, our mind is creating our brain, that's where the real work happens. And I want to share this quick example from your book. You shared, if our child is experiencing anxiety, for example, you shared that the quote thing that's making them anxious is an actual physical thought made of a stimulus response inside memories in their brain. And the mind comprises the action of them worrying or being anxious about this thought. And it just starts to make sense because, again, we just, if we are experiencing anxiety, if our child is experiencing anxiety, we get so caught up on the manifestation of the thing and we don't do that investigation.
That's so good. You hit the nail on the head. We've become a symptomatic society. So, you know, let's look at the external, let's fix it with something external. And we've forgotten all about the importance of working on the internal and teaching a child from young how to work on the internal aspects. How many of my patients, when I was practicing, would say, I wish someone had told me this when I was young. And I remember when I was a young practicing therapist thinking, I'm going to tell my kids this when I have kids, if I ever have kids. I didn't know at that stage because it was before I had children. And that desire to, I wish someone had told me. I didn't want, if I'm alive and leave a legacy, I don't want someone to say, hey, I didn't know. Because that's, I believe, key, to know that you have agency, that you have empowerment. Because suicide will increase when you feel hopelessness, when you feel like you just have no agency over your life. You know, and you can go through stuff that can have the best supportive network and still feel that. It's a self-relationship that needs to be developed. So we've really got to work on that with ourselves and with our children. You know, so it's critical. And the fact that a thought is real is such an empowering concept, because it's like this studio occupies physical real estate. The thought that's being built about this conversation occupies mental real estate. You know, it's really a physical thing. And probably the easiest way to understand is to think of the COVID virus, because it's in everyone's mind for too long now. We're kind of all tired of it. But the concept of it being a physical virus, we understand it's something that got into our body. It had the structure. It looked like something. We get that, and we get that the immune system recognized it as a pathogen and sent out the immune factors to create the inflammation so the body could read the enemy and create a response. We get that. But do we get that we get the same response happening in our brain with a psychological threat? So in other words, your brain's immune system, which is connected to your body's immune system, fairly new discovery to understand that we actually have a brain immune system too. It recognizes and reads that toxic experience in exactly the same way as it would read the COVID virus. So in other words, there's no separation between a physical substance that's a pathogen versus a physical experience that's which is an experience. So it's reading them the same. So it will send out the same immune factors to the site of the toxicity, and you'll have a whole downstream effect of physiological reactions. And the immune system essentially creates that tent of protection. So there's an initial inflammation, which is a good thing. And so you'll see an increase in things like homocysteine. And I know with your work, you're familiar with that. That's why I thought I'd mention that. And but the key is, once the body's read that read the enemy, created an immune response, it's pretty effective at wiping out the source of threat, and then the inflammation goes away, and the immune response, the soldiers go and wait for the next time that something similar comes. That's the principle of a vaccine, and any kind of response your body learns to recognize the enemy. The problem is a thought is so much more complex than a pathogen, because a thought is something that is connected to a source and is driven by the mind. It's a result of, so it's not this isolated pathogen that you can actually just use the immune system. And by the way, if your mind's not working, your immune system can't work very well either. It affects the efficiency of the immune system. But that pathogen, that thought is not quite the same. It's more complex because it's coming from a very live source. So the root system is a very, very live source connected to the source. So it's kind of like a computer that's plugged in and just keeps supplying energy. And until we unplug and isolate, that immune system is going to be very confused, because it's going to send out the immune factor. It's about a 3-week period that we kind of work in, more or less biologically, for these cycles of healing, more or less, sort of around that region. And if we don't do something or have an effective response, so it's reading the system and so on, if we don't do that, then the immune system says, oh, okay, I need to send out more immune factors, more and more, and then the whole immune system becomes confused, so you get a hyperimmune response, which also happened with the COVID virus when we didn't have your body couldn't fight it, so you needed some support. So yes, you do get a hyperimmune response for difficult pathogens. So our thoughts become into that category, fall into that category. What I'm saying in simple language is that we will have a very strong physiological reaction that will increase inflammation instead of decreasing inflammation, because inflammation is only healthy for certain short periods, not long-term periods, because then there's a downstream effect on all your physiology, increasing vulnerability to disease by 35 to 98% over time. So if we don't unplug, we're going to create that in our body, and then that will feed back into our mind and increase the mental health issues too. So what I've tried to do is, based on this concept of how thoughts form and the impact of if we don't deal with our stuff, if we suppress or don't get our relationships with ourselves right and so on, is how can we get to that source and unplug. You can't change your story, you can't change what's happened to you, but you can change what it looks like inside of you. When you unplug, that thing gets weak. It's going to lose energy. So then energy is never lost in the brain or the body. Principle of conservation of energy. It will be converted. Yeah. So it will become something else. So if you're managing your mind, you can unplug and then change this toxic looking tree into a healthy tree. So eventually this thing shrinks and becomes one little tiny branch on there, which is, oh, I remember how or what happened, the bullying, the whatever, the traumatic experience, the supporting a loved one who's battling with something. It becomes smaller, but your healing and your new response has been wired in of how you're going to manage that. So you change that experience. Then that influences how you play out into the future. Now, Shawn, that's what we're not doing. What we're currently doing in our current system is, and I shouldn't say totally not, there are a lot of therapists out there that get this, that are working to the root, that are doing this embrace process, reconceptualize. There's some amazing therapists and even psychiatrists that are very enlightened, and I work with some of those as well. But in the majority, if you look at what's happening in the majority, the situation is, okay, that signal coming from there which is a cry for help and a cry for awakening to what's going on, is being read as a symptom of a disease. And it's based on an assumption that that symptom is coming from a neurobiological or chemical cause, like a chemical imbalance or a genetic flaw, or a brain, your brain's broken, but that's not proved. It's never been proved. This is what I find. It's called medical battery. That's what some of the scientists are terming it, where we're telling people that you have something that you don't have.
Yeah.
So that then is what's happening.
And that speaks to the power of the mind too, and believing that.
Believing that, because that's what we fed. That's that 95%. If you hear the same thing all day long, all week long, all month long, for 95% of the day, that's the messaging that you're hearing. That's what's going to be how you think that's truth, because that's what you've heard so much of. So it's wired into your brain. So that's where you're coming from. So when someone tells you something different, which is what I am saying, you've really got to well, what does that mean? That's not what I've heard. But what did you hear? What is the source? We need the knowledge. That's why I put references and encourage people to go look at the science, why I do the science, why I publish journal articles and scientific articles, so people can go and examine what is the science behind this. But if we just say, okay, it's plugged in, don't worry about the roots, don't worry about, just, it's okay, keep it plugged in, that's whatever. What we're interested in is the fact that we're just looking at the impact on the brain. We're seeing, because that will create a change in the blood flow, a change in the way that the magnetic, that when you use things like MRI and that kind of thing, the magnetic response in the brain, the blood flow in the brain, the electromagnetic in the brain, it's like on a SPECT scan, it'll change the way that the blood flows, so it looks like little holes in your brain. Or on a QEEG, it'll look like different types of energy. And if you don't know what you're reading, you are actually what you're looking at is an impact, not a cause. Yeah. So yes, someone who's depressed will have these changes in the brain, but that is not the cause. That's the impact, and we have to address that impact. But you don't address it by medicating it, because when you medicate it, you're not fixing that, you're making that worse. What you're doing is you're going to another part of the brain, and you are reducing and numbing the brain. And so that you feel better, and you feel like you can cope more. Maybe. Not everyone. No, most 85% is placebo. So the mere fact that you've been given a pill, sugar pill does the same thing.
Speaks again to the power of the mind.
Mind, totally. But it's not dealing with the source. So therefore, those people feel better maybe temporarily. Then the placebo wears off, the side effects come. They're told the disease is getting worse, they get a different dose, polypharmacy, and the whole story begins. Yeah. Hopefully some therapy in between, which gives them some strength. But the fact is, it's still plugged in. You haven't dealt with the issue. Now you bring children into this environment, which is what we've done. The child's being bullied consistently at school. Paint the picture. Here's this little 5-year-old going to school, and there's a child at the school who's being beaten up by their father or being abused by a parent. So that child takes that bullying out on the weakest link that he sees or she sees in her school. And that weakest link happens to be this child who persistently day after day is being bullied. Now that child is then coming home, and there's a sibling or there's an animal, and they are taking out that bullying that they've experienced because they don't know how to process it on someone in the house, or it comes out in other behaviors, withdrawing, depressing, getting depressed, bedwetting, whatever. There's a whole lot of ways this could come out. Point being is that if we see, there's a consistent, persistent pattern of behavioral change in my child, and we say, the teacher says, hey, listen, your child's not working properly, or this, your school calls you in, suddenly there's this panic. Hey, what they're going to do, send you to a psychiatrist. They're going to ask you a few questions. If you're lucky, 15-minute questionnaire, if you're lucky, and your child will get labeled with your child's got bipolar, pediatric bipolar, or your child's got ADD, or your child's got a mood disorder or anxiety disorder. So you're going to get told your child has a disease. Your child does not have a disease. Your child has a bullying issue, an experience that's building into the brain, and that is affecting how the child is showing up. The child's bullying of the sibling at home, or hurting the dog, or ripping up plants, I don't know, just whatever, or not sleeping, crying, or withdrawing, those are signals that the child doesn't know how to talk about. So we as parents need to be trained to learn how to read those signals and sit down with our child and have ways that we can connect and communicate so that they can process those signals to find the story, to find the thought, and then help that child process. Because Shawn, along with this, is we've got to be very careful that this current model has created a sense of fragility in children. And there's some great books out there about our fragile society where you protect them from anything bad, and it goes to helicopter parenting and that kind of thing. And the problem there is that you have to build up psychological resilience as much as you have to build up resilience, immune resilience, and health in your body. And when you're working out, you've got to build up resistance in your muscles. We have to build up that same resilience. And the challenges of life are how you do build up that resilience. And how you do is by acknowledging and validating a child's signals, how they're showing up, and then helping them process those and moving towards a solution. And that's what we've removed. We've removed that process in the majority of cases. I'm not saying every parent doesn't do that. Parents instinctively do this to a certain level. Yeah. But our messaging from our society is that if your child presents with certain packages of behavior, there's a problem. Quickly, get them labeled. What's the messaging? There aren't enough child therapists. Article came out, New York Times, I think last week. There aren't enough child therapists. A parent can open up anywhere and find more messages of, does your child have these symptoms? Quickly, get them to a psychiatrist, get them treated, catch it now, because if you don't treat this now, and that treatment is inevitably a level of medication or a technique like CBT, which is excellent, but if you use it in the wrong way, all it does is keep the thought plugged in and just basically puts a band-aid on the wound. If you use CBT techniques in the right way, they are fantastic. They will achieve a goal. But parents aren't told this. So that's why I wrote the book.
It's still complementary to, again, getting to the root.
Exactly.
And, so first things first, your analogy connecting this process to our immune system function is fantastic, because most people can wrap their minds around that.
Yeah.
And when you said before about our immune system being very good at identifying issues and getting rid of it, a better word possibly here, especially in the way that you broke this down, would be an adaptation to that exposure, right? Yes. Our body adapts. It doesn't really disappear in the same way that our thoughts or negative thoughts never disappear.
No, we adapt. They shrink. Beautiful.
And because that's one of the things too, we're trying to erase it, we're trying to get rid of it from our mind.
You can't do that.
It's shifting the perspective and how we're viewing the thing. And it also, that process, learning how to do that, makes us more resilient. And I want to actually circle back and talk about resilience in a moment. But by the way, for folks that are listening to the audio version, when Dr. Leaf is in, you have to watch the video version, because she brings the props along. We've got a look at basically what's happening in the brain with a positive thought and a negative thought. And we got some other stuff we'll get to in a minute too. But I want to put a study up for everybody, because when you mentioned, even that analogy with COVID and our adaptation in a sense to that. And by the way, one of the most overlooked things, because of the destructive aspect of it, is the fact that somewhere in the ballpark of 95 to 99% of folks had mild to moderate symptoms, if any at all. Our bodies adapted pretty well to this thing that's very virulent and did impact a lot of people. And part of that process was the hyper-inflammatory response. Yes. But that was also based on our immune system's perception of the thing. And so this brings me, we'll put this paper up for people watching the YouTube version. I was really digging in during this time. And one of these papers, this is looking at the psychosomatic aspect of COVID-19. And the researchers detailed pretty cleanly that folks who were experiencing anxiety prior to contracting an infection had worse health outcomes. And being stressed about the thing isn't going to help us at all in mounting an appropriate response, whether it's to a virus or whether it's to a life experience, right? And so this brings me back to, and I'd love if you could talk more about this. Right now, we do live in a society where many of us, especially as parents, if we grew up in the 70s and 80s, we went through stuff, right? And we also had this whole phenomenon of, quote, being outside, right?
Exactly.
Now today, the world, being outside, stuff's going to happen, more likely to happen in the kind of physical world versus a lot of psychological, mental, emotional stuff that can happen online and, through technology. But we learned to be resilient. We learned to be responsible. And we had a certain template that had existed with humanity for quite some time.
Exactly.
And interacting with people in the real world, right?
Yeah.
And so today, by us going through stuff, by us experiencing bullying, by us experiencing tragedies, whatever the case might be, we naturally want to protect our children, right? And here's the rub. We can responsibly protect our children, obviously, from basic stuff. But today, we also have to be intentional about giving our children the opportunity to go through things, to build up
Exactly.
resilience, and develop their own inner skills to process and overcome the challenges they face. And that's what this book is really all about. And so, if you could, can you talk a little bit more about the tools that you're using? You actually brought one of the tools along with you
Yeah.
here to help us to educate and to support our children, which starts with us acknowledging and actually paying attention
Yeah.
to our children, which is
Exactly.
another thing. If we're distracted, we're not going to be doing that. But you
Exactly.
brought along a friend here that's an inroads in communication with our kids, but also obviously there's a lot of tools for older kids in the book as well.
Absolutely. Well, Shawn, I love the way you set that question up. It's excellent. The very quickly to allude to how we've overprotect our children, I talk about helicopter parenting versus what I call safety net parenting, and the way to build resilience. And before we dive into sort of more about the techniques and tools, helicopter parenting, I think everyone understands, it's just doing everything for your child and trying to protect them and creating that sense of fragility, kind of sending the message to the child unintentionally, but the message goes through, hey, I don't think you can cope with this. I don't think you're strong enough. If you've got any kind of emotion, well, that's a brain disease. We've taken that feeling of, who am I? Do I have any worth? Do I have any ability and power to do anything? We remove that from a child. Now, they're not consciously saying those words, but children are very, very intelligent, and we know from recent research as well that children understand a lot more than what they verbalize. So we've got to stop assuming that they don't understand. You can teach kids very young a lot of stuff, and they're picking up. Already a 2-month-old baby understands empathy, so that's valid. Safety net parenting is allowing your child to think of an acrobat. There's a big safety net underneath, but they'll climb up that ladder, they'll swing and do their thing, and if they fall, but they get caught by the safety net. Whereas a helicopter parent is just like always hovering. So what we need to do is let our kids climb up climb up those ladders, do that swinging around all over the place and trying out, but you're there as a safety net. They're going to fall, but you'll catch them. But they have to climb and they have to swing and they have to fall. And we're removing that from them. If you teach a child the management of their mind in the process of climbing, swinging, and falling, you're going to have a child who's going to build resilience. We do that by modeling. So one of the very first tools is to take this concept of helicopter versus safety net parenting into the practical zone. And that is, it starts with you as a parent and you as a human. You can't help someone effectively if you're not actually helping yourself. Now, you've never helped yourself totally, so it doesn't mean that you can only help others when you've helped yourself. Totally wrong. In the process of helping others, you help yourself, you improve your own ability to heal by a factor of 68% and plus. But it's a balance. If you go into fix mode, you're going to then ignore your own stuff and you're going to fix other people. And this is a very common problem in humanity. It's like easier to fix someone else than fix my own issues. So if that's can happen in parenting a lot, where we see our children, we want to protect, it's all driven by a lot of love and care and all the right intentions. But then you can't fix your child. You can't think for them. You can only facilitate and guide. And that's where the safety net stuff comes in. So then if your child sees you managing your life and seeing you do lose your temper, freak out, shout, get upset, sad, cry, have an argument with your spouse, get mad at a friend, get upset, get jealous, get envious. These are all part of being messy. What you're telling the child is, hey, it's okay to be a mess. Now listen carefully. It's okay to be a mess. That's the message we need to send to ourselves and our children, but we also need to add to that. But we need to learn how to manage that mess. So it's okay to be a mess. It's part of being a human. I'm a mess. I'm your mother. But I can manage this. There's a way I can deal with this, because that's not who I am. The mess is not who I am. The mess is who I have become because of what's going on in life and experiences and so on. So therefore, I give you permission. I validate how you feel. I see the signals. I see it in myself, whatever, but we validate. So tool number 1, I'm giving myself permission to be a mess, and I'm giving myself permission to manage my mess. and I'm giving myself permission to let my children see me a mess and manage my mess. So therefore, when you walk in the door and you had a bad day and the toys are all over the floor and you open the door and you fall over the toys and the dog comes barking and the kids have made a mess and they're all screaming and, you know, your husband's just watching TV and, or I mean, I'm painting some dumb scenario, but anyway, you may yell at everyone, get totally frustrated, your shoulders tense up, and you say something that you don't mean to everyone in the family, and suddenly, you know, there's this whole explosion happening. And that can happen in various forms. Obviously, you can either pretend it didn't happen or just withdraw, or just like tell your kids not to, or just ignore their responses, or do whatever, I don't know, whatever, but that's not going to help. What we need to do is say, oh gosh, I'm a mess. I'm sorry I yelled. I said things to you I should never have said to you. I own it, I acknowledge it, and I apologize for it. I feel like this, and this, obviously age appropriate, language appropriate, boundary appropriate, you know, that kind of stuff. You're not going to tell intimate details to your children. It's not fair to load things on them that they don't need. But you're going to acknowledge what your feelings, how I feel mad. I'm frustrated. My body is so sore. My heart's palpitating, and I think that my job sucks, and whatever, and what have I left out? So emotions, my feelings, my behaviors, and I'm shouting at you. So what I've just described are 4 signals. I've just done a quick first step of the system I've developed called the Neurocycle on myself, and I'm modeling it for my child, which is this whole part of step 1. Step 1 is all this, it's okay to be a mess, this is what I'm managing, and I'm giving the example of this day after work, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do after I've yelled and whatever is I'm going to gather awareness of my signals and say to the kids, oh gosh, I'm sorry, I yelled. I'm totally frustrated. So yelled behavior. I'm totally frustrated. Emotions. My body is like my heart's beating out of my chest, bodily sensation. And I actually hate my job today. So what I've done is made 4 statements where I've described to the child why I turned up like I did or showed up. So the child doesn't think it's them. Because if you don't tell a child, even an adult child, if you have got behaviors that are different, that are disturbing, they can see something's wrong, and you don't explain why, their most natural instinct is, what did I do wrong? So they internalize and think it's them. You also, if you don't deal with it, you're telling a child, oh, that's bad. We can't, you shouldn't have that. And there's a stuck hidden thing. So by doing this, I'm acknowledging the mess, and I'm actually giving them steps to model, and I'm modeling. So then I would go and say, okay, why? Okay, well, this is I had a bad day at work. There's been things happening, and I'm really thinking maybe I should, do something. But there's all these, maybe, and you tell to what extent. Maybe a work colleague's done whatever. So you tell them a few little whys, as I said, language appropriate, etc. Then the third, that's reflect. Reflect is like shining a light through a prism, a white light. When you shine the light through, it's white. When it comes out the other side, it's multiple colors. So what you're doing is you're providing the fact that once I have gathered awareness of those 4 signals, how I'm showing up and acknowledge them, I'm now going to reflect. Those 2 steps have taken the signal, and imagine those signals are attached like balloons, 4 balloons coming out of this thought. So I'm pointing to this toxic thought for those that are listening. I'm pointing to a toxic looking tree, and there's 4 balloons coming out of it. Those birthday balloons, but these are now not happy balloons. And each of those say, the emotion, the behaviors, the bodily sensation, and the perspective. So as I do step 1 and step 2, the most incredible things happen on a neurophysiological level. This thought that those are attached to start moving up. So they imagine that they're starting to float, that those balloons on a string are pulling that thought from the non-conscious to the conscious mind. Now we know from neuroscience that the minute that you're aware of a thought, the neural network that is housing the thought starts breaking down and becoming weaker. Now that is indication of, I can change. If it's stuck in the non-conscious where it's suppressed, then we can't change it. But that's why we have to go through the work of bringing it up. It stays plugged in and going. If I bring it up, I'm starting to pull the plug out. I'm starting to weaken so I can change. Then you would move through to the third step, which is basically some kind of writing. I've developed different systems of writing. It's not journaling. This step is pouring your mind and brain on paper. So it's kind of gathering it's writing down what you gathered and reflected on. It's bringing order out of chaos. It's dumping stuff all over a page. The key thing here is not lines, dump it all over the page with colors and drawings, and the more messy the better, because that actually makes the two sides of the brain work together and pulls information up from the non-conscious, gives you more insight, shows you associated things, and starts taking you down the tree from the branches down to the root. So it starts giving you more depth, self-talk. What am I saying? How am I? So it gives you more information. So in this simple example, you could you've got a blackboard up in your kitchen. You know, some families do that and you write things, which is a great tool to have with kids. I recommend making one of your walls in your house into a blackboard. You put that paint on, because it's a great place where people can immediately go and express and write and so on. And so you could even have a little comfortable chair there, a little bench, some plants. Make a pretty area in your house that's the safe space where you can do your mental health work, where you can do life work, or Neurocycle, which is the name of this 5-step process. You could call that area in your house anything you want. So as you, the mom, doing this, go over to that area, do this gather awareness, reflect, and then in that area, because that's the safe space where we can be a mess and no one's judging, and that's where we go sort our problems out. And you know, even if you can't get there physically every time because you're in another environment, or you're in another house, or you're at school, that mentally can come back into your mind. You train yourself to recognize that this is a space I move into. Okay, so you can turn around, then you could just write all over the wall. You maybe draw a picture of someone shouting, or a desk at work, whatever comes into your mind to express very quickly in that moment. Maybe it's a few words, whatever, just all over the place. Then you look at what you've written, you say, oh gosh, yeah, it's this guy at work who just keeps on running me down, and you know, it makes me feel so bad about myself, and I have to stand up to him, and I don't know how to stand up to him. So now that's the recheck, what I've just done. So I'm looking at what I've written, and I'm looking at the pattern and the trigger, and this is what's happened, and that leads to, well, what can I do about this? And you know, kids are unreal. Your kids will start saying, well, tell him, Mom, or shame, Mom, maybe get another job. Whatever they say, it may or may not be helpful, but you've involved them in the process, and maybe your husband or wife, partner jumps in and says, okay, whatever, and then you start working out some level of an antidote. You're not going to solve the whole thing there and then, but you've demonstrated a process, you've helped yourself, you've started weakening this, and then you say, okay, for today, I'm not to think about this anymore, let's make dinner together, I need a little action to close this off, and tomorrow I'm going to pick this up again and work on this again to get a solution. So today, feel so much better now just talking to you, and my little action is, hey, let's make dinner together, and let's cook one of Shawn's recipes together and do our whole thing. And that would be my act of reach. Now, I've elaborated the process, but you've just modeled, you've done that step number 1, where you have said it's okay to be a mess. You've taken yourself as a model, and I show this concept throughout the book in various ways, that you can do this, because we need this all the time. You know, your children may be in the car having a tantrum, and you need to get yourself under control before you deal with that, or they're having sibling rivalry. Get yourself under control before you react and say the wrong thing. So that's something we have to do. That model then teaches the child. So then when you've now given the child permission, when they are bullied at school, they come home, they go to that area in your house, and also in that area in your house is a box, and in that box are these toys. You can have toys, whatever. I've created a little Brainy toy, which is the character that you'll see in the book, called Brainy, and here we've got it over here, Shawn. Here we go. So it's a little character called Brainy that we've fallen in love with, and Brainy helps us activate our superpower, and our superpower is this neurocycle, and this neurocycle is this ability that we have to seek step by step, go through these 5 steps of gather, awareness, reflect, write, active reach, and recheck. Now, little children, you don't have to use those big words. You just basically get them into the rhythm of the cycle, and I explain how to do that. But essentially, those 5 steps are a scientific sequence that will bring the network into the conscious mind, unplug it, start shrinking the toxic into a tiny branch and building the healthy new way of coping, and therefore unmasking resilience and helping you cope with that mental health issue. Otherwise, I have a bunch of suppressed stuff. So another thing, just very quickly, with the young kids is if they don't have, which they don't always have the language, the younger they are, the less they have the linguistic skills, but they learn the language as they're getting older. And also when you model this process, it's amazing what kids will actually learn and how much comes out. It'll amaze you when you get into this. By having an area in your house and having something like Brainy and a few other toys, and I give lots of ideas, but having 4 boxes filled with pictures. One box labeled emotions, another labeled behaviors, another labeled physical sensations or bodily sensations or how my body feels, and another one labeled how I see the world, perspective. That could just have a pair of broken sunglasses and fixed sunglasses, because perspective is quite hard to tell a child. But if you put a pair of sunglasses on and you put the broken ones on and you're being bullied, that would be what they would choose. Life doesn't look very nice. It looks horrible. But if you're happy, you put on the nice sunglasses. I mean, you can get as simple as that with young children and more complex with older children. But that, having those pictures there, if a child doesn't have the words, they can pick up Brainy and they can pretend that Brainy is, let's find a picture for Brainy to show how Brainy feels. So that makes a child feel safe. If they can transfer over to a toy and enact it through so it becomes an opportunity for them to demonstrate through toy, picture, and maybe no words, and maybe a few squiggles on that blackboard wall that you've got, or whiteboard, or whatever you decide to do, as a point of communication where you can sit down together and move through the process. So you're teaching a life skill, and this can something that, think of it like this. People might say, well, how can I do this with the busyness of life? In 63 days, if you don't manage it and don't try something like this, within 63 days, you have reinforced that bullying. Now, this has got even bigger. So you've got 63 days worse of a problem. Your brain is changing every day. The situation's still carrying on. And maybe that situation does resolve without you interfering, and your child sort of, now is not being teased anymore. But there's another situation, and there's another one, and there's another one. And because we never dealt with the first one, that means they're more susceptible to the next bullying incident, more sensitive to the next bullying incident. Or maybe we'll start reading things that aren't there. So the sensitivity becomes distorted. So we want to try and provide every opportunity to try and build this in. You work out, all of us work out. We know that we've got to dedicate a time and find a space. You don't work out, you have either equipment or you find a little space. In other words, you find a space, whether it's a gym or whether you just stand on the spot and run up and down. You find a space. We do the effort, we make the effort, we make the effort to do the exercise. You make the effort to buy the food and make the food that works to bring healing to your body, etc. Why don't we do that with our mind? We eat every day, we clean our teeth every day. And our mind's making us clean our teeth.
Right.
And without our mind, we can't clean our teeth.
Or work out.
So why don't we allocate the same kind of list of priorities? As much as I need to clean my teeth and breathe, I need to have a mind management space in my life. Yeah. That's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah, and it's like I said before, it's the most important thing, because everything springs from that. And in the book, you outline these 4 warning signals, or warning signal branches.
Yes.
And by the way, I want to reiterate this point again. We have to pay attention to our children. If we're just helicopter parenting and just trying to take care of everything and one of the tools I think that we tend to go to is just downplaying, negating, oh, they won't play with you, I'll play with you, right? Instead of, again, helping our children to have, but first, again, we have to pay attention to the warning signals, which you share this emotional warning signals, behavioral warning signals. So these are things that they're going to be displaying. Bodily sensation warning signals, inquiring how they're feeling, and perspective warning signals. So, and you share this in the book, as you help your child to unpack these signals, you will teach them how to find the origin story in the roots of a particular thought tree. This is so important, to find the root of this. Getting to the roots allows them to begin the process of reconceptualizing the experience in a way that works for them rather than against them. That's a direct quote from the book. It's so profound, and it makes so much sense.
Thank you.
But we're not doing this. We're not taught to do this.
No, we're not. We're just seeing the signal as a symptom. And that's key. We're seeing a signal as a symptom, and then immediately going to the medical model. And so we're not helping our child. And that's why I quoted that early study that I read today about how a child labeled with ADHD, put on Adderall, is very likely to get some sort of diagnosis, a multiple diagnosis and multiple polypharmacy, because the symptoms reflect the withdrawal. So the side effects of Adderall used and Ritalin used can reflect those of something like the symptomology that's described in the DSM on bipolar disease. So in other words, there's a distortion going on there. So if we read the signals, as messengers, as something that's good information, if we see depression and anxiety not as these scary things, but as actually incredibly useful emotions because they're filled with information. And they have a sweet spot. You never want to get rid of, and now this may sound crazy, you never want to get rid of depression and anxiety or stress or any of these things, because when they're operating in the right way, when they're being managed, they actually help you be a human that grows resilience and helps you appreciate the beauty of life. To be a bit depressed when you see what's going on in the world around you is a very good human reaction. It develops your empathy. To have a bit of anxiety when you're about to go and start something new, I mean, this is good stuff. The problem is when it tips into the unmanaged zone, then it becomes bad for you. In the brain, when we do research, the QED, I use QEGs for our research because it looks at the reflection of energy in the brain. So it looks at how the waves of energy move through the brain and how the brain is responding to the impact of life. And we talk about a sweet spot, the Goldilocks principle. You know, the whole Goldilocks story, that porridge was too hot, that one's too salty, this one's just right. Depression, anxiety, all these things have a Goldilocks principle applied to them, where for your level of depression is not the same as mine.
No two depressions are the same.
No, they're not the same. But also, what's good depression for you is a little different to the good depression for me. But I need that good depression, and so do you. So does your child, because it makes them human. It makes them build their character. It makes them understand. It provides feedback. They are messengers. They're not illnesses. We should embrace them, to process them, to reconceptualize them, instead of trying to eliminate or suppress them.
We've medicalized our emotions.
Pathologized childhood.
Yeah. So deeply. It's so deeply ingrained in our culture today. And again, is it working? Like, we really have to be honest about this. I had a great conversation with Dr. Chris Palmer, a Harvard psychiatrist.
Yes.
And he shared a study that was looking at, what are the long-term benefits or what are the long-term results of standard of care, traditional medication, psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
And over the course of this multi-year study, tracking people, and there's about 500 people in the study, they found that only 1 out of 10 of these people put into standard of care with modern psychiatry actually had a resolution of their symptoms. Only 9 out of 10 people were still depressed. Some of them had a management of symptoms or had a reduction of symptoms. It was like 30% of them for a time. But it was not sustainable. It was not lasting again. So if we have a system right now where 9 out of 10 people do not get better, we have to question the system and stop essentially just pointing the finger at ourselves like we're broken.
Exactly. And also the SOC, standard of care, is extremely expensive and also requires a lot of manpower. And there aren't enough therapists. There isn't enough manpower or money to run the current system. That's besides the fact that it's ineffective. And there's another study that supports the one you just quoted that came out very recently that is done almost like a meta-analysis, and they've pretty much tracked it's over a period of time. You know what meta-analyses are, and it said pretty much the same thing, that our current mode of care, standard of care, is not working. So we need to then look at the fact that if you teach yourself and your child to manage your mind, that doesn't cost anything. It's a minimal investment. It's a book, and I have an app as well called the Neurocycle app that is giving you this basic skills for under $100. I mean, the books, I don't know what the book costs, something, whatever, but I'm just saying it's not something that's expensive to invest in, but it's something that you need to do because you live with yourself. I think we need to think about the fact that your child's waking up with anxiety. You don't have a therapist on tap. You as a parent can't wake up every hour, every night, and answer every single phone call and still survive. That's also not helping. You've got to learn to help your child to know, okay, when I wake up in the morning or when I wake up at night or when this happens, this is what I can do now, and then I can get the support that I need when I see my mom when I get home from school or something like that. We need to help our kids know how to manage the moment. We need to help ourselves manage the moment. When you wake up at maybe 3 a.m. with an anxiety attack, you don't have your therapist on tap. You have you. What are you going to do? What is your child going to do? There's a case I talk about in the book, and I don't know, Shawn, if you were going to bring it up about the child when I discuss trauma, because I go into all the different aspects and things, and the story of the young boy who was very physically abused and sexually abused from as young as 2 and 3 odd months of age, and eventually got to the removed from the biological mother and went to the biological father, who was excellent, incredible person, and stepmother, and they didn't know what all these behavioral symptoms were, and this child wasn't sleeping, and you can imagine every kind of behavioral issue was evident as that child was from 3 years of age. And investing lots of time, energy, money into every sleep aid, every treatment you could imagine. Things just were not improving. And it was this person, the stepmom happened to come upon my book and my app and started doing the app just for her own, just to help her. She was like, felt like she was going crazy. I mean, this is really hard to deal with something like that. And she's the stepmom. And she, and anyway, long story short, she started changing the way she was coping. The child that was 8 at that stage noticed the mother and said, "What are you doing? I want to do that with you." And started doing the Neurocycle with the mom. And it wasn't even the children's book version. It was the mom just adapted it down and helped them, and he started doing it with her. Within 4 days, this child slept through the night. This child had never ever slept through the night since birth. These people couldn't go out for dinner. They'd have to start the night. They couldn't do anything beyond 5 o'clock because they had to get this child ready for bed, and nighttime was this nightmare for this whole family. And this child slept through. This child sleeps through the night. You know, I mean, this, I can tell you 1,000 stories. This is why I wrote this book. And I mean, that story is quite a heavy story, and I put a few stories in there. But it's so radical. And so I didn't go to that person. I didn't give that child therapy. I didn't give that mom therapy. That's what I'm trying to say. My goal is to empower people with the management system that I know you can learn, and empower you to be able to help yourself and your family. And then recognize within that, okay, we do need a bit of extra support, a bit of therapy. Great, go for it. But get yourself into a place of mind management first.
It's the most important thing. You live with yourself, like you just said. And, you know, you just shared it. We can have great supporters and coaches, but we also need to become aware more than ever about effectiveness and not mistaking treatment for effectiveness. And also, you know, again, the labeling process that happens, and then the medicalizing of our emotions and our children's emotions, and the framing, once they get that label that they're broken, they don't work right, and they need this thing in order for them to survive or to thrive in this culture. And you mentioned this really interesting phenomenon of polypharmacy. We got to put another study up, by the way. This was published in BMC Medicine, and the title of the study, listen to this: Relation of Severe COVID-19 to Polypharmacy and Prescribing of Psychotropic Drugs. They found significantly higher rates of severe outcomes from COVID-19 when people were on multiple medications, number one.
So familiar with that
and
research.
in particular, psychoactive drugs.
Yeah.
And
which are basically antidepressants, antipsychotics, antidepressants, and they're not even anti-anything. They're just pretty much anti, you know. So, but having said that, we've got to just put a caveat in here. If people are on drugs, any of these antidepressants, please do not just stop them after listening to this conversation, or if your children have been put on them. It's absolutely essential that we recognize that the role of a psychotropic drug is pretty much like an ibuprofen. If you have a headache, you take an ibuprofen. It basically numbs the pain. It doesn't fix the source of the pain, but it gives you relief temporarily. But you don't go on that ibuprofen chronically. In other words, you don't now live on it. You now try, if you have repeated headaches, you start trying to find the source.
Because it's going to destroy your body.
It's going to destroy your body. So a psychotropic is seen in that same way. First of all, you can't just stop them because you'll go into terrible withdrawal, and because your brain has adapted. You spoke about adaptation earlier on. Anything you put in your brain, whether it's an experience or whether it is food or a medication, it changes your brain. Psychotropic drugs change your brain quite dramatically. That's why they feel very effective, because they numb the pain. So they can really help people, but not long term. Long term, they create changes that are very difficult to deal with, and they can heal. So it's extremely important, and I just wanted to say that because we've mentioned it. We're not saying go stop your drugs immediately. We're also not telling you, you know, you only you can make the decision, an informed decision about, find out what these drugs do. They're not medications. Medications go to the source of the problem, and actually, hopefully, like an insulin for diabetes. We know that there's a lack of, the pancreas is not producing enough insulin. We give insulin specifically for that. So it's specifically targeted. Type 1, not type 2. Type 2, we got to address through diet and exercise. Yeah, there we go. Too much insulin, we have to address through diet and exercise. But it's still quite specific. So thank you. Type 1. So, but when it comes to a psychotropic, they're not doing that. They're not addressing. They're simply psychoactive in that they're numbing. Like alcohol changes the state of your brain. That's what psychoactive means. These drugs do that. So that's why maybe if someone's in a really bad state and had a really, you know, something really traumatic, and they need temporary relief for maybe 24 to 48 hours, that's how you would use them safely. Kind of like how you would use an anesthetic if you're going for surgery. You certainly don't want to stay awake for it can get cut up. So, but you wouldn't stay on anesthesia long term. It's the same. We need to operate in the same principles. Then that's safe use. But if, the whole thing is not to rely on them as a crutch because of all the side effects and that kind of thing. If people choose to withdraw, I have a lot of resources on my blog and website from top experts in the world on how to withdraw. Get informed and withdraw correctly under medical supervision, and very, 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 very slowly. So I just wanted to put that in there, that people don't say, I'm going to stop my drugs, and then, you can get suicidal and all kinds of things.
Yeah, which is, again, it's unfortunate that, the chemistry has changed in such a way that we become addicted, right?
Very quickly.
And
very addictive.
Again, oftentimes without resolution of the thing, and sometimes, many times, worse outcomes happen over time.
Yes.
Because like you just mentioned, and I don't think we think about this, it's literally changing your brain. Everything in our reality is changing our brain. That's a very significant impact because you're putting it into your system. And not just that, you shared this at the beginning, it's not just affecting our brain, it's affecting every cell in our bodies,
body.
right? Because it's all connected.
Everything's
and it's
connected.
All controlled.
Nothing's
primarily
isolated. Everything's connected.
Everything's controlled primarily by mind.
Yeah, exactly.
At the end of the day. And if you're not aware that this exists, and it's just like even your mind is the ability to notice and to realize that you have a mind is your mind in a sense.
That is,
right?
you got it, Shawn.
And it's it's like an awakening.
Exactly.
Happens.
That is exactly. Thank you. You got that. You said that so beautifully. And you're talking about that awakening. You mentioned those studies earlier on. And just I wanted to also mention that a lot of the so-called effectiveness of psychiatric drugs and standard of care, they run in very short periods of time. It's either over 3 weeks, and if you're lucky, it might be 6 or 9 weeks. Their follow-ups, they don't do many follow-ups. When they do, if you do follow up, you generally find that there hasn't been good remission. They have gone back and felt worse than before. But the average person who doesn't read science doesn't know that. We're not told. The average person in the street doesn't know that those studies that are so-called telling you that the drug's safe, or that TMS is safe, or ECT is safe, they're not done over long enough periods of time, and they're not very rigorous research. And there's a lot of flaws in that research, but that's not what the average person's being told, which is really sad. So you've got to question everything about science. Even what we say, you've got to question everything.
Everything, yeah. Make that a practice. That's one of the things I've been really, especially the last couple of years, to question our own biases. Because even a lot of things in life, they'll serve you for a season. At a certain time, at a certain place that you're at. But we evolve, we change, and right now having this system where again we're medicalizing everything, and we've got to look at the other end of the monetizing happening from human capital. Essentially, we have an economy now. The U.S. healthcare industry is a $4 trillion annual as of last year industry that's yielding we have the worst results of any developed nation
in the world.
It's crazy, and so much is going into it, but our outcomes are not very good.
No, that's so true, and the money's going into a system that's already broken, and especially
right. We need more care. We need, even you saying earlier, like we need more therapists. Yes, we have a place for that. But is that going to solve the issue? Are we addressing the real root problem?
Because there aren't enough therapists. Even if you did have more, there's still not enough, because everyone needs a therapist.
We need more access to healthcare. What if the healthcare sucks?
Exactly, and what do they mean by more access and more screening? There's research coming out, and I'm sure you've read it. The screening that they're doing for adolescents is increasing risk of suicide, because these kids are getting labeled, and now they're doing increased screening very young, which is increasing risk of suicide. So we have to be, as parents, we have to be informed. As teachers, leaders, uncles and aunts, whatever, we need to be informed. We need to inform our children. We need to have these conversations.
Let's talk about labels, because what if our child is taking on this label, I have bipolar disorder, or I have something even more prevalent today. I was seeing this, you've been in this field for a long time, and you've seen the, I would say evolution, but devolution of
regression.
Mental health. And, some people might think, again, we have better screening now. That's why the numbers are so high. But we're seeing there's a precipitous growth, really a precipitous explosion in ADHD, right?
And it's expanding. It's bleeding into other categories. It's an expanding thing. Now the latest is to and you've got undiagnosed if you're in your mid-30s and late 30s. That's the next sort of age group that they now, you're undiagnosed. Every second person in that age group is now going to get diagnosed with undiagnosed ADHD.
Right. And so, realizing again, there can be a manifestation of certain symptoms that fit into those categories: hyperactivity, struggling to pay attention. From my experience, any of us can have this happen, depending on the context, by the way. And potentially, if we're under exam, we can be diagnosed with something, depending on, even if we went and worked out right now and we go get some blood work done, it might look a little,
Exactly.
our cortisol might be too high. If we get a hormone panel done, our inflammatory biomarkers might be up.
Exactly.
We can probably walk out of there with medication.
Oh, yeah, easily.
And again, it's just based on this temporary snapshot of a thing, but it might change your entire life.
Exactly.
And so what happens when our child gets that label and they find out, okay, this is why I'm not doing well in school. There's something wrong with me. I have this condition. What happens internally, or what happens when we start to reaffirm this label that we might get?
We break their psychological psychological immunity. We lower their self-worth because they think, well, I'm broken. And we remove hope. There's a sense of hopelessness that I've got to rely on something external. I'm not good enough. I'm broken. So there's multiple layers when we label. And it's incredibly unfortunate because literally the label locks them in. And that label in itself is an experience. And I went through that very long, convoluted process of explaining how an experience gets into the brain and lands up being like this. Well, someone who's in a white coat, who's in a position of authority, who's labeling you, has basically spoken you as a child, spoken into your life. You've wired in a toxic tree, literally, that says, well, I am that. But that's not who you are. That label isn't. I tell you, Shawn, I could actually cry because that label that they're giving that child has no scientific basis. There is no. You can't say that is a brain that's broken, and you should do an MRI. There's no biological underlying reasoning behind it. It's a disproved concept that was always a hypothesis and very bad research that has been pulled apart and shown that that isn't the case. So what we've done is we've made a huge, massive assumption, and we've put that assumption onto the child, and now the child is wiring that in because it's come from a position of authority, and I can see the anxiety in my parents, and I can see the problem with the people around me, but they don't understand what's going on totally. They know that all that they know at this stage is that because there's a level of understanding, as I said earlier, that there's something wrong with them. But there's conflict because deep down inside, they also recognize, but this can't be true, but they don't know how to verbalize that. So we lock them in and they wire that toxic thought, they shift their perception, you mentioned that earlier on, of themselves, and they basically set themselves up to be a failure without even realizing that that's happening. So a label is only useful, a name like PTSD, ADHD. I mean, ADHD is just another whole can of worms where they've say that there's studies saying that that's an ADHD brain and people with ADHD have a smaller brain. That science has just been so disproved. What we have is not ADHD. And I was at university when this term came out and the DSM-4 came out, and I remember one of our professors saying this is going to create such a problem in the next 30 years, and how right he was. He said we're going to have people that are going to be labeled with something that doesn't actually exist. It's not an it like diabetes or cancer. It is a description of behaviors. So if you want to use the word ADHD, classify it as under the behavioral warning signal, and it's a great word to use if you use it as a description. Attention, you're battling with attention, so describe it, tell the story, put it in full sentences. Link it to the context. Don't just lump a label on it that's got no context at all. That means, we know if you say something, tell someone something about something and you don't provide the context, you're going to lead to a misperception. That's what we're doing to our kids. We are giving them a label. We're giving adults a label that leads to misperceptions of oneself. And that doesn't, and there's a lot of research saying that this has reduced stigma because we're saying, hey, we've got to pay, we don't look down on someone who has type 1 diabetes, but we do look down on someone who's got a learning problem. And so let's talk about it. That's been a good philosophy, to talk about it more. But the way it's been spoken about has actually made the stigma worse, because now instead of saying, okay, those are a bunch of behaviors that are the are because, you dig around, that child is not getting 3 meals a day. That child's coming from a broken home. That child's mother's working 20 jobs to try and they're a latchkey kid and they are whatever. You'll find a story.
Yeah.
And when I was trained, we would spend hours with a team working with a child, and we would never ever label. We would just look diagnostically over a period of at least 7 sessions. That's at least 7 hours, and have team discussions to try and work with the child to find the story but that's expensive and that takes time, but it worked. We had kids that weren't medicated. We had kids that were actually learning how to learn, and we found the stories, and we could try to then find the social support and whatever they needed. But that takes a lot of time. But if we work as a community, if we shift our perception and work as a community, we can bring in the grandmothers and whatever. There's a community that we can then recognize and see, okay, well, little Johnny's really battling at school, battling to pay attention because they made one mistake and were teased by whatever because the teacher got frustrated and yelled at Johnny, and so Johnny now closed down and is not listening, so he's terrified of math and I can't do math. But that child's been labelled with ADHD because they're not functioning and they're teasing, getting whatever. So the whole thing blows out of proportion. But if we take the time to say, no, Johnny doesn't have ADHD. Johnny has some behaviors. Let's talk about them. Yes, there's a bit of attention. Yes, there's a bit of hyperactivity. But when is the attention a problem? What's the pattern? What's the trigger? What's the context? The who, what, when, where, why, how. Hyperactivity. Who, what, when, where. Let's map the story. Okay, we've got the story, literally a neurocycle. Now we can action. Let's maybe get the grannies in the old age homes and the grandpas who are bored, bring them into the school system. Let them sit with the kids who are battling. Let them help them with their reading. You create this beautiful community that we originally had in that you see in Japan and Okinawa and Africa and places that aren't in the standard of care model, where the community brings up the child. Where you just think of our home environments now, where it's a mom, dad doing everything, working and trying to be everything. And the parents, it's hard work being a parent. I know, and so do you. Where's your relief? Do you have the granny coming to take your kids for, maybe a weekend, so you can have a weekend on your own just to just decompress? Having, so that you don't because sometimes you can yell at your kids, or you can see things, create situations because you're just totally exhausted as a parent. You don't have sufficient community support. So there's a very inexpensive way of involving community, changing our social structures from the ground up, not from the top down, because the top down will take forever. It can happen, policy and all that stuff must happen, but we need to create models from the ground up of community support, bringing in the grannies, bench therapy, all this kind of stuff, help the parents. So that's what I'm trying to do with our work as well, is if I can equip you as a parent to help yourself and help you help your child, you're going to tell your friend's going to tell your teacher, at school's going to say, I'm interested. Before you know it, you have a community. The old age home down the street, okay, let's bring them in and let's help them help the child can you see the difference? So now we remove the label, we create a normal situation. And maybe Johnny needs someone sitting with him for longer, because maybe Johnny does battle to learn, but eventually Johnny will find Johnny's skill. And I had a patient once who was battling terribly at school for years, and all the story and the whole typical situation that we see in labels and medication or whatever. And when they came for the very first session and I did my normal, the whole starting the evaluation process, one of the first things the parents said was that, because they said Johnny is an incredible, it wasn't Johnny, I'm just using Johnny, random name, is an incredible musician. And I thought, oh, this is great. What's coming next? But, there was a big but. We have stopped Johnny playing the piano, because until Johnny's grades improve, Johnny is not going, because all Johnny wants to do is play the piano. Yeah. And I said, okay, that's where we start the process. Johnny starts playing the piano again, because that's where Johnny's creativity. By the way, music is so related to math. Math is one of his weaker subjects. I can guarantee if you let Johnny play the piano before he does his math homework, you're going to have more success. So we shifted. That was one of the first things that we implemented, and the shift was very quick. So this is what I'm saying. We need people to be able to guide parents like that, because they were doing their best. They weren't being horrible to Johnny. They were saying that the school had said Johnny's a problem, his math is bad, remove all rewards, make him do more homework, and that's how they managed that situation. Can you see what I'm saying?
Of course, we want our children to be well and to do well in society, of course. As soon as you talked about context, I thought about a child who might struggle paying attention during math and science, but they pay exceptional attention during music,
Yes.
right? And creating
Yeah.
music or, writing or doing art or playing a video game, whatever the case might be. It's not that they're lacking on the potential to do the thing. It's the context has changed even in our society,
exactly.
and lacking community, lacking the ability to pay attention to our child's gifts. We have this newly invented form of education today, this kind of factory line
Exactly.
working,
Oh, gosh.
it's this is all new stuff. We're still
Regurgitate the-
experimenting, but
yeah.
we have this idea that this is the definitive thing, it's the best way. But again, look at the outcome of our health as a
Teachers
society.
hate it and the kids hate it, and it's not working.
Well, the great news is, first and foremost, is that we have access to this now, thanks to you. And like I said, I feel that this should be in the package when we have a newborn at the hospital and they're giving you, here's some bonus free Pampers or whatever the case might be. And also, here's this incredible book that we all should have access to, especially today with all of the different things that we're dealing with. And I love this because this is inroads to dealing with our own mental mess and modeling healthy behaviors around those things. And so I think it's inspiring for a lot of parents to make changes because of their kids, So it's just another layer of empowerment and inspiration. And in the book, you walk people through applying the Neurocycle with their child and applying the Neurocycle to specific life experiences like trauma, like social interactions, and more. It is such a great resource. And depending on when people are listening to this, if you can pre-order the book, do it ASAP because you're going to get a wonderful bonus. Can you share just a little bit about the bonus?
Absolutely, thank you, Shawn. There's you can get access to. We have a coloring book and Brainy, and there's a big discount on that. So there's actually a coloring book with Brainy that you can color in, and then the little toy. And then the other pre-order bonus is we're starting a private club that parents can actually call in at Zoom. It'll be a Zoom virtual club where people can actually then present their problems, and I talk them through it and help them process, take all these issues and help them work through those. So they'll get a month free on the virtual club.
Awesome. So more access to you.
Yes.
And so go to drleaf.com and pre-order the book. And of course, anywhere that you get your books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that good stuff. And if you're listening after the book has been released, of course, you can get it from your local bookstores as well. But this is something, we want to make this a huge bestseller and change the culture. Make sure that we're getting access to this information for our children to change, because it's going to be what they're passing on to their children. We've got to interrupt this pattern right now. And, I just appreciate you so much. It's a joy reading your books. I was actually doing a hyperbaric chamber yesterday, and I just ran through
oh my gosh,
60 pages of the book in one go. And it's just a wealth of knowledge and insights. I was highlighting so much.
Oh.
And if there's anything else you want to share where people can follow you online, be good.
Thank you. Well, drleaf.com is our website, and my social media handles Dr. Caroline Leaf, and the podcast is called Cleaning Up the Mental Mess. I'll find you there, my interviews with you there. And Shawn, thank you. Really, I appreciate that you as a parent, you understand the need. And so thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about something that's very close to my heart. And I appreciate what you said. Thank you.
Hey, if you like this video, make sure to check out this video right here.
That means our children are not allowed to be in that pure essence. They're not allowed to say what they feel if it's going to hurt mom or dad. And that's really dysfunctional. That's why we grow up to not know who we truly are.